Welcome, everybody. Glad to see everybody. We're doing this unique setup so you can see what a meeting looks like. We've all sort of forgotten what they look like. This is a lovely venue that we will be experiencing next year. By the way, shout out to Mark Smith. The place is completely renovated. It's gorgeous. It really, really is nice. Can we do a quick pan of the area so that everybody gets a sense of how lovely this is? It's a little, the breeze off the Pacific is a little chilly, around 60 degrees right now. But as you can see, people are gathering from breakfast. We've got about 8 or 10 people who braved it from the Southern California area. And I know that everyone's under travel restrictions still. Hopefully that'll end by the summertime. I think there's a real feeling of optimism that we'll be able to pull off something close to normal for the summer meeting at the July. Yeah, make sure you get Marcy in the picture there. For the July meeting, which is at Coeur d'Alene. Speaking of which, there is the notice for the summer meeting, which again is July 22 and 23, and at the resort at Coeur d'Alene is up on the website. Take a look at it. Again, hopefully that's 5 months from now. Hopefully we'll all be back to pretty much normal. And I would look forward to seeing everybody in person so that we can begin to get together and network as we normally have. We have a good program set up where we're going to hear from WEC. We're going to hear from Tim Reynolds at WEC. They're going to give us the briefing on their after August report, 2020 report, which sets up nicely for a panel that we're going to have on trading in WEC around Q3 in light of the August events and quite frankly in light of what occurred in ERCOT last week. And then we'll probably have a little bit of a roundtable where I want to hear from people about their experiences and any color they can add to what's gone on in Texas and the surrounding areas and how that may affect us. And I'll call on somebody like Dave Francis, who never has an opinion, or others to sort of talk us through what they're experiencing right now in Texas. There's quite a bit of political fallout that will come from that. But before getting going, I want to remind everybody that we have a couple of people from the trade press that will be on this. This is anything that we talk about is off the record. That allows us to have a conversation that's free and easy amongst ourselves. If you want to have a subsequent discussion with somebody on the record, contact them directly to see if they'll be willing to be attributed to, but otherwise everything's off the record. Before we go to Tim, and one other thing, if you're not speaking or you don't want to speak, please be on mute. We'll call on people to unmute themselves if they want to speak. Questions and answers. We're going to get the questions and answers. Everybody's used to Zoom now. Why I think the best way to do this is if you just put your questions, anything you want posed or thrown out in discussion, send it directly to me. You can send it to the whole group if you want to, but if you just want to be discreet about it, send it to me, and then I'll serve as the moderator for these questions and answers. If we have somebody who wants to actually ask a question on camera, we can arrange that too. But there's Gary Ackerman just getting in the picture. He always has to do that. Sit down, Gary. And we have a few people who braved it from Arizona too. Frank, is there anything else I need to cover? We're all good? Okay, with that, why don't we go to, and by the way, I want to thank Jordan White for making Tim available to us. Jordan, as you know, left the Utah Commission and is now VP and General Counsel with WEC. He's doing a great job there. But we're happy to hear from Tim and WEC. You can tell us about your investigations into the post-August timeframe.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Reynolds, and I'm the manager here at the Event Analysis Situational Awareness Group here at WEC. I am excited to talk to the group today about the impacts of the August heat wave, as Scott said, and the impacts that it had on the interconnection and some of the analysis that we did here at WEC based upon it. And so I will say before we go into the slides that there have been some other reports that have been written and published about it, most notably the CAISO in California Commission report, as was mentioned yesterday. I just want to be open and honest with everyone that I won't be commenting on those reports, but mostly focusing on the analysis done by WEC staff. There is a lot to learn from this heat wave, so that's why I'm going to be mostly focusing on what we're going to be doing here. So if we move to the next slide, just to give some context about the August 2020 heat wave, as if you're kind of like me with the pandemic, everything going on, even just August 2020 feels like a long time ago. But starting on August 14th of 2020, that was a Friday, a large ridge of hot air called the heat dome formed and caused a heat wave with exceptionally high temperatures here in the Western Interconnection and caused quite a bit of stress on the electrical system as companies encountered constrained conditions with generation and transmission to be able to meet their load demands. So some may not know this, but the demand was so much that the interconnection set a new all-time peak demand record for 2 consecutive days in a row. So if we go to the next slide, because of the extreme impact on the interconnection, WEC staff performed an analysis using the structure of an industry-adopted process. It's called the NERC event analysis process, as some may know it, to learn what happened, why it happened, and honestly, what can be learned from this event to prevent reoccurrence. And so one thing I will point out is that this analysis is not done to point fingers or disprove any other findings. It was done to learn and understand about the effects of the heat wave and partner with the industry to prevent reoccurrence. It is strongly felt by the team that is a matter of if, not when. I'm sorry, it'll be a matter of when, not if, we experience some similar situations moving forward, but I'll explain more about that later. But part of the process used by WEC in this analysis were also methods similar to what you can find in the Department of Energy document to perform a root cause analysis. If you bear with me to geek out just for a moment, what the group did was a variation of what's called a fault tree and a cause and effect methods. So if you actually look at that very blurred image to the right, the reason why it's blurred out is because that's actually a snapshot of part of the process we were going through. It is not an easy process and is very time consuming. But one thing that by using these methods and the approach that WEC took, one thing that was very interesting that kind of set this apart was how we were able to look at the impacts of this on an interconnection as a whole, meaning that we were looking at things from Canada down to Mexico, from California to Colorado. We were looking at the whole Western interconnection as we were going through this. So this is why I'm excited to present to the group today, for those that may not know any of these findings, but to let you know of our, as I said, our findings, our observations, our recommendations, and our lessons learned from this. So if we move to the next slide, to be able to help present the findings and recommendations in the best way, we grouped everything into kind of 4 groups to be able to, as I said, organize it and help to disseminate the information. Those 4 groups are, as you can see, the high load demand, inaccurate forecasting, resource adequacy, and transmission use. Let's just go ahead and just jump right into it then. So on the next slide, the first topic we're going to talk about, though, as far as the findings from the team, is in regards to high load demand. So as I said before, we hit a new all-time peak record for the Western Interconnection for 2 consecutive days. The first day happened on the 17th, which was a Monday, but then it was beat again on the 18th, which of course is a Tuesday, with a peak demand of 162,017 megawatts. Because of this high demand, there were several BAs that were placed into an EEA, where about 40% of all these EEA events, so sorry, let me back up. For all of 2020, 40% of all these EEA events occurred during this heat wave. Now, let me explain just a moment of what an EEA is. as you can see with the abbreviation, it's an energy emergency alert. So it's a condition where a balancing authority has exhausted all their resources and can no longer meet their load demand. So to assist them, they are placed into an EEA for one of 3 levels, as you can see, with level 3 being the highest, which really means that a BA is ready to or in the progress of shedding firm load. I do want to make a point that regarding EEAs, this is not something that a BA should be considering to use on a daily operating practice. A BA should really be doing everything they can before this occurs, before they're placed into an EEA. And we'll be talking a little bit more about this in just a little bit, and the impacts that these EEAs really show and tell a story. So unfortunately, though, as was reported in the news, one BA did have to shed firm load for the first 2 days of the heat wave. But what the news and all these other, some of these other reports don't really show is the full story of what happened throughout the entire heat wave. And so if we focus on the EEAs and we paint this picture over the 14th through the 19th, we're really going to see a story on how the heat wave really impacted the interconnection. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So here we have just one balancing authority. This is Friday. Let's see here, Friday, August 14th, where one BA was placed into an EEA. Remember what I said before is that EEA 3 is the highest, meaning that an entity is about to shed load or is in the process of, or may have already done it to some degree. So for the most part, it's not telling us a whole lot, just one BA. Let's move to the next slide. So here we have, it's Saturday, August 15th now. We have 2 BAs that are placed in some sort of variation of an EEA state, but again, nothing hugely significant. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Here we have Sunday, August 16th, with just one BA being placed into an EEA 2. Now, as I mentioned before, we set an interconnection peak demand for 2 consecutive days. So as we move to the next slide, we are going to see the first peak that happened. So this is on Monday. What is interesting here is we now have 6 BAs that were placed into some sort of EEA state throughout the day. One thing that definitely caught our eye not only was the increase in number of BAs that were placed in EEAs, but no BA shed firm load this day. And that is to say that they were not performing actions like demand side management type programs or calls for energy conservation. In fact, when we were gathering data to perform this analysis, we also asked balancing authorities to provide us the megawatt amount of what these demand side managements or energy conservation actions might have attributed to. For this particular day, which was the most as far as summing all of that together, we had just about below 5,000 megawatts of demand side management happening around the peak load time, which means that if it wasn't for these energy conservations and demand side management programs, we could have had an all-time peak record of around 167,000 megawatts, which is quite significant high. And I will talk more about these conservation efforts later as far as what they were and how they helped. But what I do want to do is move to the next slide when the peak did occur. So here we are on Tuesday, August 18th. We see not only there are still a high level of balancing authorities in the EEA state, but the level of those EEAs are even higher. We see more entities in the EEA 3. So it was on this day, as I mentioned before, we set a new peak record for the interconnection, but again, no firm load was shed. So go ahead and move to the next slide. We're now on a Wednesday. You see the number of balancing authorities in one of those EEA states is we're indicating we're over the hump. We can see that the impacts of the heat wave are slowly trickling off. Let's see here. So what really happened is the team wanted to start to compare what really happened during this heat wave as well, to where we had a huge number of balancing authorities in these energy emergency states, but yet no load was shed for this time frame. So as we continue to looking through it and looking at our analysis, if we move to the next slide, is one thing that was noticed by the team through looking at all this information that we had collected was about the day ahead forecasting. So if we look at the chart in this slide, the chart sums up all the balancing authorities in the Western Interconnection. So this is everyone, again, from Canada down to Mexico, California to Colorado. So the red is showing the sum of the actual peak demand or load for all the balancing authorities. And for those that want the term, this is coincidental peak, meaning in which we lined all the days and the times for all the BAs to make it as accurate as possible as we could. And the blue line showing the sum of the day ahead forecast as far as what they were projecting to be the peak demand the day prior. So as we can see on the 14th and 15th, load was under forecasted by just over 2%, which means there was a difference of unplanned generation for about 3,600 megawatts on the 14th and around 3,200 megawatts on the 15th. What is interesting is in January 2018, Scott, thanks for introducing, some of the things that have happened recently too in the Eastern Interconnection and in Texas about cold weather events. There was also a cold weather event that happened around this time frame in 2018 that was also investigated by FERC and NERC, and WEC was a member of that team. For those that would like to know, it's a report that's entitled January 2018 South Central Cold Weather Event. But one of those findings from that report was the importance of accuracy of the day ahead forecasting. This is because the longer out you can forecast with accuracy, the more that can be done to try to help mitigate the impacts of this unplanned generation by doing things like bringing back generation or transmission that was previously out for service or maintenance to be able to try to help mitigate these errors. What is interesting though is when we asked the BAs that were in the EEA state as to the cause of them being placed in it, some of them responded that frankly they were placed in it because the demand was a lot higher than what they had forecasted and it was difficult in finding generation to purchase. So they had to go into that EEA. What was interesting is as we continue to ask questions and talk with the entities involved, something was very interesting that we learned that was due to the current impacts of the pandemic in weather forecasting. I don't know if everybody knows, it has been on for 2020, and this is due to less travel from airplanes. At first, I didn't really believe it, but I started looking into it more, and this is true. There has actually been news reports and studies already performed, but as planes travel throughout the air, they bring back information about temperature, wind speeds, and everything else as they travel. And this helps to improve the weather models and the accuracy. And as it was explained to us by talking with one of the entities, that if the temperature forecast is actually off by 1 degree for what they use in their load forecasting models for the next day, one entity specifically had it nailed down that they said it can be a difference of about 120 to 200 megawatts variance for them. So if there's a 2 degree fluctuation, you're now talking about 240 to 400 megawatt variation for them on it. So the accuracies of forecasting temperatures can also impact of what happened during this time frame. As I mentioned before, as we're continuing to talk with everybody else, there were some entities that responded to us that on the 17th and 18th that happened here, their productions of wind and solar generation was lower than their day ahead forecast and were not able to meet their demand obligations. And this takes me to our next group about resource adequacy. So let's move to our next slide. One thing that I do want to say before I talk about this slide is that this part does not make variable generation look well. It is not the intent of WEC to place an emphasis on one type of generation over another. And I support what Commissioner Clement said yesterday. I thought when she said this, it was perfect, about not making an event or taking an event and making it political for one resource type over another. So in this slide, and another one we'll show here a little bit later, it explains something though that we do need to make sure we understand and plan for with variable generation that needs to be accounted to be able to prevent future occurrences of what we saw in this heat wave. But again, no emphasis on one type of generation over another. So one thing that is trending in the West right now, which is not a surprise to anyone, is the increased use of variable generation. So in looking at the chart to the left, we see that the net generation used by the type of generation, and this is for US only, mainly because we didn't have Canadian and Mexican data to be able to put into this from those balancing authorities. I will say, as this is based on the WEC State of the Interconnection Report, more information about all of this, though, can be found on the website, and I do have some links at the end that can point you towards that information. But what we can see, however, is that from 2013 to 2019, overall, there's a 1% change in total net generation, so not a significant change. However, what we do see is an increase in the use of solar and wind, with a decrease in that base load generation, the thermal units that's represented in as green on that chart. But again, this is something we already know and we see. But the reasons why I bring this up is during the heat wave, the chart on the right shows how the increase in variable generation use impacted things. And so this chart is based on what occurred on the 16th, which is a Sunday during the heat wave. The blue line represents the total loading for the interconnection. Again, this is from Canada to Mexico, California, Colorado, with the numbers for the magnitude and the scale on that to the right. The yellow chart represents the solar generation and the gray the wind for the whole interconnection, with the scales to that to the left. I just mentioned this, just want to make sure everybody understands there are different magnitudes. So by observation, just want to prevent any sort of confusion of any sort of quick comparisons, because we've had that before. But what I did is I inserted two straight vertical lines that marks the peak of the solar and load demand for this day. So from the solar peak, which is about 16,500 megawatts, we see it decreasing, and by my measurements of about 6,300 megawatts of solar generation to basically between the first vertical line and the second vertical line. So that's where I'm measuring the 6,300 megawatts of drop in solar. Let's see here. What this though means though is when we lose that amount of solar, we do have to make it up from someplace. Now to tell the whole story here, and hoping I did the rest of my math correctly, but if I take that number and I subtract it from the increase in wind generation that we had during this time frame, but I also add the increase of load demand that occurred in the same time window here, I get a total that the interconnection had to overcome as far as demand, with that decrease in solar, the increase in demand still going on. We were just shy of 24,000 megawatts. So not only when we had our day ahead forecasting being off, but there's also an increase in demand and generation during this time frame of making up for the loss of certain variable generation. So let's see here. Now each day in the heat wave was different, and as resources were already tight, it was difficult to find this available generation during this time frame, as I said. But this gets us to our next group as far as our findings regarding resource adequacy. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So as we already looked at day ahead forecasting, resource adequacy planning is also involved here. So while preparing for this part of the presentation, I asked our statisticians on the best way to explain how resource adequacy planning is performed. So, and they said, and bear with me, the following: the typical deterministic approach to resource planning identifies the peak demand hour, applies a flat, fixed planning reserve margin, and compares this information to the expected generation capacity. This approach assumes that if the highest demand hour is resource adequate, all other periods are as well. So for those that were able to follow that statement, honestly, you should get an award. What I had to do for me and my more simplistic mind, I had to sit there, think about what they were saying and ask them some questions, make sure I got this right. So far as what I got out of this and what from what I understand, let's see here. I'm trying to look at my notes really quick. So in a more simplistic way, you forecast a year out and look at the hour that is your worst case. And if you can meet that hour, you should be okay for the rest of the time. So again, that's my simplistic notes on it. And so historically, this approach has been successful because any variability with these forecasts were relatively low. And entities could rely upon other parts of the interconnection for resources if they needed it. However, variability over the years has increased in the Western interconnection with the availability of generation from other parts of the system may actually no longer be there at the times that are needed or are planned for as they used to be in the past. For example, there are companies in the northwest part of the interconnection now that would historically peak in the wintertime, which means in the summertime they had extra generation that would be available. However, today, some of those companies are becoming what is known as dual peakers, meaning their summer demand is about the same as their winter demand now. And what we saw in the heat wave was that generation that was planned on being there in prior years was no longer there as it was being used by other companies now. I will show you in the next slide about this impact. So if we move to that. So go ahead and start playing the video, and I'll go ahead and start talking about this. Are we able to play it? There we go. So what we are going to see here is a percentage of the load demand for each kind of subgroup here in the Western interconnection compared to what was expected in the prior year's forecast. I will say that due to the timing of when these forecasts are done, it was a year prior, as I mentioned. So it's based on pre-pandemic information. The WEC Resource Adequacy Group does want to go through and determine the impacts of the pandemic, but they're still collecting the information. But overall, what you're seeing here is when anything is a higher percentage, that means the actual demand was higher than what was forecasted. Overall, the system-wide demand ranged from about 67 to 99 percentile as compared to the same day probability forecast. The highest demand reached 62%, more than the expected 50th percentile forecast for the KMEX area, with the loads on Sunday the 16th. What is interesting as it continues to play through is you will notice that for the KMEX, Central, and Canada areas, the loads did not go down at night. And so there has been some speculation that might have been due to battery storage and just basically charging everything else during that time frame. So let that just keep playing out. And we will make the slides available to everybody, but I will provide Scott and everybody else 2 links to these videos so you can be able to see that. What was requested for us too is to be able to do this, to be able to look at how renewable generation was versus planned. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, so go ahead and play the video. So this image will show the percentages again, as I mentioned, but with renewable generation. Some quick notes on it is overall, the total renewable generation remained constant with forecasts ranging from the 34th to 77th percentiles, or from the expected, for those that follow, is the 1 and 2 to the 1 and 3 levels. So I'll let everybody watch this, how it kind of plays out during the heat wave. And so when you see the negative though on this, that means that it did not meet actuals or what was forecasted. And when it goes positive, that means it's actually above it. One thing to note is near the end of the heat wave, wind generation started picking up significantly more, and was actually able to be a help for the interconnection with that increase in wind generation. Okay, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So as my time's starting to wind down, I just want to go ahead and cover one of the last things and some positive observations and next steps here. One thing though, with not only was generation constraints that were happening, as I mentioned before, there were also transmission constraints with the availability of the transmission. To understand, for those that may not know how the Western interconnection is shaped, I usually always like to use the donut analogy. Just picture a giant donut circulating over the interconnection with a hole kind of center somewhat around Nevada. So what happens is, in the case of like what happened in this heat wave, there's a lot of generation up north, a lot of demand down south. And as entities look to procure generation from the north, it'll flow either through the left side of the donut or the right side of it. It all depends on where that generation is and how it's coming down, but there's always a portion that flows in both sides, and usually just more on one side than the other. In this particular case during the heat wave, though, there were some planned generation outages due to a separate weather event that happened back in, I want to say it was March or April of last year. What happened is those planned outages that were out to be able to fix these transmission lines caused a congestion point in the Northwest where additional generation was not able to be transferred down south during this time frame. The rating that was basically the reduction in rating on that congestion point was about 1,250 megawatts at times. I will say that they did try to work to raise that rating back up on the 14th and 15th on the days that a firm load was shed to be able to help entities help meet their demands and everything that was going on. But what was noticed in doing that was something we called a phase angle difference. Not to get too technical here, but if this angle becomes too high, it can actually rip apart the Western interconnection. And this has actually happened back in 1996, where 1 month we ripped it into about, I want to say 6 separate islands in the Western interconnection. And then in a couple of months, it happened again and it was ripped into about 4 separate islands. What we had was, fortunately, some operators that were on shift these couple of days that were operators back in 1996 when this happened. So they were able to use their expertise to actually identify this and try to help mitigate it. Another thing that was a finding by the team was, as we were looking at this, there were other transmission outages and impacts to that. There was some affected, again, from the north to the south transfers. But again, the major one that had the most impact, I already mentioned, but we also looked at from east to west flows if there were any major transmission limitations. As there were no limitations on there, I do want to point out, though, that in conversations we had with multiple entities, it was stated by them that transmission was there, but not necessarily generation, as they did have to use generation for their own, and they were about one contingency away of having to shed load themselves. So again, going back with those EEAs, even though the first 2 days was the one that made it on the news the most, the Monday and Tuesday were the most stressed on the system, where, as I said again, if there certain entities were one contingency away of having to shed load. So I want to go ahead and move to the next slide. Some of our recommendations that are coming out of this is that WEC needs to, and the industry subject matter experts need to talk and be able to give some more guidance to the balancing authorities and reliability coordinators. As you see, we had a lot of entities in an EEA, but when we looked around to try to say, hey, what are some of the best practices for when a balancing authority is in an EEA state, there's not a lot out there. And so we are planning to work with others to be able to create a guidance document to be able to help out with this. We are looking at potential modification to some standards to help out with this. One thing I will point out is with the previous slide we had, there's something called phase shifters that help pull or push the energy transfers on that left side or the right side of that donut. But there can be some improvements in how we use that coordination that could have helped out during the heat wave. And we also want to try to look at different ways to be able to help improve load forecasting. As I mentioned before, we want entities to start preparing now for this coming summer, so they can have things in place for it, because again, it's not a matter of if, but when we'll see this again. It could be different from a heat wave. It could be more fires that are impacting the transmission system and that available generation that can be transferred. So some other similar scenarios that could also play out. But we also want entities to start investigating those phase angle concerns more to see if there's more limitations on the system that could be played out. Next slide. So as I promised before, there were some positive observations. There was some proactive coordination amongst the reliability coordinators here in the West. WEC has a tool that we developed in-house here from the performance analysis group called the Maverick tool. For those that are familiar with it and the presentations that have happened with this, it did predict that there was a potential in 2020 for having to have firm load shed due to unavailability of generation resources. So the heat wave did help support those findings, and I'll have some links to explain some more about this here in a minute. But there was a use by what we call synchrophaser data. It's a real-time data that comes into the operators, and that's what was used for the phase angles. For those that are familiar with the Southwest blackout report where San Diego was blacked out, it was the recommendation from FERC and NERC at the time that operators used that data. So here's a success story of where it was being used. But again, the impacts of energy conservation. This plot right here shows one of the balancing authorities where this is on the 17th and similar to the 18th, where energy conservation was being asked. And as they described it, they were hoping that it didn't lead to a volcano, because the load for the most part flattened out. And what they were hoping wouldn't do is all of a sudden it would just spike as if the volcano erupted. As you see, it significantly stayed flat. Some of that was due to them working aggressively with state leaders to ask for public reduction in electricity use, calling on companies like Tesla and other customers not to charge their equipment in cars during the peak times. This was very interesting for those that had Navy shipyards. They were asking the Navy to disconnect their ships from the shoreline power and run on their own generation to help reduce that demand. So again, there was a lot of things that came into play that helped to reduce all of this. So as we go to the next slide here to wrap things up, WEC will be publishing more of this information on our website, and that'll be coming soon. As I mentioned before, we're going to be working more with stakeholder groups here at WEC and at NERC to be able to create those guidance documents and fulfill the recommendations we have. There's also a lot of resource adequacy work that is going on. What I want to do is move to the next slide. So as this will be sent to everybody, this shows you some links to that resource adequacy report with some of those findings from the Maverick tool, everything else on the Western Interconnection. They're also doing releases more focused on each sub-region within the area. So they've already had 2 of those meetings that already happened. The next one is on March 2nd. That is 10 to 11 Mountain Time, just to let everybody know. But I also provided a link, as I mentioned, to that January 2018 event. But for more information about everything too, while we're waiting to get things on the website, if you'll go to the next slide. We have given other presentations with some variants to it as well for more information here as well as a link to the KISLO's root cause report. And for those that have a hard time sleeping and would like to know more about that 1996, where we separate into multiple islands, there is a report on NERC's website that talks about that. So that being said, the last slide here is just basically my contact information. And so, like I said, I'm happy to present it. Hopefully I didn't bore everybody to death.
Thanks, Tim. That was great. You didn't bore. I don't think you bored anybody. It was a very good presentation. And I think that I think I actually will look into that 1996 report. I'm just that sort of person. But we've got a few questions if you'll stick around and be willing to entertain them. Anybody who wants to ask some questions, feel free to direct them to me. I'll I'll feed them in, provided we have time. One question that came in, and just one observation, it points out to me, and I know this isn't WEC's role to opine on this sort of thing, but it certainly points out that if there were a network markets across the West, a lot of this coordination would sort of naturally happen because of the market signals. So this is just a shout out to the market participants in the EIM entities and others and state regulators that having one or more RTOs in the West certainly would have helped the situation considerably. So just something to consider. Something we found out, and when I was at FERC, we did the report on the blackout in the 2003 timeframe. That if MISO had been up as a day 2 market with all of its the information that would have been conveyed, it most likely would have stopped the cascading blackouts that occurred as a result of that. So let me go to some of the questions that we've got, Tim, for you. Would you ask Tim if WEC's evaluation of intermittent resources included the effect of wildfires on solar resources?
Yeah, so we do know that there was quite a bit of smoke coming from California at the time that was based upon looking at some of the data and the analysis could lead to believe that there was impact from that smoke on the solar resources as well. What is interesting is you take that one plot that I had for the 16th, where I was explaining how much generation we had to recover. The day prior to that, on the 15th, you really see not a nice, beautiful curve from the solar output for the interconnection, but it comes up and it starts to jag quite a bit. Some of that speculation is due to the wildfires and the smoke from it.
That's helpful. Also, we have a question that says, Tim said that WEC as a whole broke peak load records in that week, or was it this week? But how did, this person's referring to the particular week in August, but how did CAISO specific loads compare to past records?
So CAISO, their projections were actually to beat their all-time peaks. I'll put it this way: on the 17th and 18th, where they had basically a lot of energy reduction happening from energy conservation and the outreach efforts and everything else, if all of that didn't occur, they would have beaten their all-peak demand. I will also mention too, there were other entities in California that said their all-time peak did occur on the 17th. And as I mentioned before, that's very possible to happen, even though the interconnection happened on the 18th. It's just, yeah, as a whole, everybody together peaked on the 18th more.
Okay, thank you very much. Question that's come in: how do WEC and CAISO interact in EIM operations during stress conditions, and would WEC suggest any changes to EIM from a reliability perspective?
Yeah, and so a lot of stuff that was talked about the EIM is in CAISO's report, and again, that's not something I really want to go to in this presentation at this time. We are aware of the report and the information they have from that, and we are in contact with them. And again, if it's something that looks at the reliability or impacts the reliability of the interconnection, that is something that, yes, we do care about. So.
Thanks. One other question we've got. Great presentation by Tim. As you know, we are working on summer readiness on various fronts with our summer readiness initiative and resource adequacy. The guidance that Tim mentioned, WEC is going forward to provide all BAs and RCs across the region some additional, I guess it's a question. When does Tim anticipate the guidance for BAs and RCs across the region coming out? The additional guidance.
Yeah, so for instance, the one that the guidance that we mentioned regarding the RCs and BAs while in EA state, what are some of those best practices? We've already started conversations on that. There's a lot of interest on the NERC level as far as one of their committees is called the NERC Resources Subcommittee. There is some interest with some of the members in there to also participate in this. And so we're really hoping that come March, we're going to start hitting on that, as well as trying to do some lessons learned write-up and be able to submit that through the NERC event analysis process. So hopefully here in the next coming months, you'll be able to see some information or drafts regarding that. So, but we do want to try to get some of that out before the summertime.
Since I'm no doubt working with CAISO, are you expecting some additional guidance coming out of CAISO that will be somewhat supplemental as well too?
Yeah, and so when we write these guidelines, everything else is not like we do that in our own little bubble. We work with the industry, and for those that want to participate in it, to be able to help make it a product that they can use and be able to help improve what they're doing. So CAISO, I will say, is on board with helping us do this, as well as other entities within the Western Interconnection and some possibly in the East as well.
Great, thanks. I think what we want to do is, Tim, hopefully you'll stick around a little bit because there may be issues that come up that would be nice to hear from you or from Jordan. And by the way, Jordan, thanks again for helping us out with this. I think now, why don't we just turn to our panel. We're going to have Brian Black from UAMPS, Ian White from Shell, and Ali Yazdi from Morgan Stanley to sort of discuss, in light of these events, we noticed a tremendous pickup in prices after the August events. At one point, I was shocked to hear that this price spread, which between Palo Verde and SP15 is normally about $25, had widened to $65. And that's when we got together to talk about having this panel. And of course, at the time we did that, we thought, oh, well, it's just, this California craziness, let's have it because it doesn't happen anywhere else in the country. And of course, lo and behold, we had, equally, if not more significant event that occurred in ERCOT and the surrounding areas. But let's talk first about, and this panel will begin to discuss the issues in WEC that have affected pricing and trading, particularly for the third quarter of 2021. And I think the best way to begin this is to start with Brian, who will, I think, speak to the perspective of trading on behalf of load. That UAMPS trades for many smaller load serving entities. And so, Brian, why don't you unmute yourself? And this is going to be a conversation to just sort of the perspectives of each of the panelists. And then I'll hope to have some questions from the audience so we have an interactive conversation. So Brian, unmute yourself and why don't you give us your perspectives?
Sure. Scott, can you hear me okay?
Hear you just fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, so as Scott said, UAMPS is a joint action agency that is considered really a load serving entity on the behalf of, sorry about that, a load serving entity on the behalf of 47 members across 6 Western states. UAMPS has a peak load. We're a summer peaking entity, peak load of about 1,200 megawatts in the summer. So July and August is typically when that takes place. UAMPS was set up back in the 80s as kind of an RTO pool for its members. We have members that are 500 kilowatts and members that go all the way up to 250 megawatts. So pretty widespread in terms of what our members have with exposure. UAMPS is in the business of not only serving load for our members and trading and scheduling, but we also develop power plants and dispatch those plants on behalf of our members. One thing that UAMS was set up and it wanted to do was keep this ability for the members to really make their own decisions in terms of their own internal generation that they wanted to build. That they didn't have to purchase from UAMS if they didn't want to, but that UAMS would be able to go out into the market on their behalf and purchase for these entities. And we've done that through a wide mix. We have everything from coal, gas, wind, solar, geothermal. We're looking at building a nuclear facility in 2029, if you haven't heard, kind of a small deal there. And really looking at all sorts of different options. We have a large hydro portfolio as well. One thing that came about with this last heat wave in 2020 was just kind of a reflection on market exposure. Obviously, just as most entities do, we have a good portfolio of generation, but we also rely a lot on term purchasing so that we're not fully exposed to the spot market. And looking forward to 2021, you know, with the heat wave that came in 2020 and looking for the next year, we had a lot of members come to us and really started asking questions about, you know, UAMPS exposure and what we're doing to limit that. Now, luckily in 2020, we felt like we came out pretty well. We were hedged on certain products and felt like that we were very little damaged by what happened in August of 2020. But moving forward, just seeing the forward prices for September, Q3, and even looking at them today, it looks like they've bumped up significantly since we've looked last. You know, there's things that we've looked at in terms of credit and also just megawatts that are available in the real-time or day-ahead market. You know, one thing that's interesting that came out of this ERCOT issue or just even the mid-continent area was I heard that gas traders were begging for cash when this was happening, and a lot of things like would think that was based on their ability to serve, you know, long-term contracts. So you really get into these credit issues when you see these long-term price spikes because entities are very leveraged in these moments. And if they continue long enough, you start to see defaults, which obviously coming out of Texas, you may see some companies really go belly up after this as they look at their books. We even had entities here in the Rockies that I've spoken to, a few gas traders who have told me that, you know, they really suffered for a few days based on their exposure. So to, you know, play that into the power markets, it's very similar. You have days where you're exposed to these high prices and you're not hedged. You could get into some credit issues, and UAMS feels like we're positioned well for that, but it's the entities that maybe we're doing business with, and we want to make sure that we're covered on that end. You know, one thing to add to that too, with just the implementation of EIM and WISE, you're starting to see, and I know this has been discussed heavily, but you're starting to see a lot of the bilateral market dry up because of that, because there's an opportunity cost now for these entities to dispatch into EIM and now WISE. And so it causes a kind of a false shortage of energy in these real-time markets. Now, one thing that EIM doesn't allow is you cannot put in a demand bid for load. You know, it's a generation market for real-time. It allows an opportunity cost for those generators to use. So for an entity that relies heavily on buying in the real-time market bilaterally, you have to start looking at other options, because you can't just put in a demand bid to EIM and say, I want to serve my load through the market as you would in a typical ISO. So there's definitely some challenges that are happening, and 2020 definitely brought some of those to light. That's a little bit of background on UAMPS and some of the things that we're focused on. But as you said, Scott, we're definitely excited for this conversation, but wanted to start off with those topics.
Thanks, Brian. That's a very valuable perspective to bring to the table, and I think it's interesting you raised the part about, you know, the credit exposure, not necessarily you, but you're dealing with multiple counterparties, and their credit position is affected, which then affects who you're able to do business with. And I like the idea of you're suggesting that while EIM has benefits, it has some limitations that would otherwise, you know, not be there in an ISO, the demand bid, for example. So next up, Ian, I think you wanted to talk to us about some sort of setting the table to provide some perspective around what it is, the evolving reality that we're dealing with in WEC that's affecting prices. So Ian, why don't you unmute yourself and give us your perspective?
Yeah, good morning, Scott. Thanks for having me. This has been a really great panel, both yesterday and today. So I just wanted to, kind of start at the top, and just as a blanket statement, just say, I want to give a shout out to system operators. They keep the lights on day in and day out. And when reliability events happen anywhere, a lot of times they only get reflected in a negative sense. And I just want to take the time to appreciate them and really remind everyone of the technical complexity of balancing the grid reliably day in and day out. So they really are staff that I think a lot of times is underappreciated in normal times. Having worked real time for a long time, I was never was never a BAO and working in BA ops, but I definitely understand the complexity, and yeah, they really do a lot of good. So moving on from that, I wanted to speak, just kind of setting the stage, looking in hindsight at the events of summer 2020. You'll recall at the end of 2019, we had, in the Desert Southwest specifically, a loss of a 2,200 megawatt Navajo generating station. And that was a generating facility that was, a joint owned unit between multiple entities in the Southwest. And if you would look in the past when it was running at its generation profile, a lot of times you'd see it, it ramp way up in the sort of the super needle peaks and then ramp back down. And so that, I think it's no small situation that unit being gone really contributed to one of the legs of the stool, if you will, that precipitated in the summer, August 2020 events, as it relates to just less local generation in the Southwest. Also, I think higher level items, as Tim said, we're looking at more regions that are coincidentally peaking. And I think, looking in the past, we had balancing authorities in the WEC that were firmly winter peaking and others that were firmly summer. And as the loads and the nature of loads on the system change, and with climate change as well, those coincident peaks are only going to continue to evolve as we electrify more industries, and two, just as needs for resources change. And so those two things in mind, I think that really set the stage for a lack of local capacity and lack of local resources in the Southwest, and that put more pressure on other regions to help fill in those needs on the spot market. And so kind of looking ahead to 2021, one of the things I'm thinking about is this, this year we have a unit at Centralia in the Northwest has retired. Also, Boardman has retired. And so I think that this really points to a further degradation of dispatchability, and, points to the system with the build out of renewables, at times likely not being energy constrained so much, but just really capacity limited. And I really appreciated the earlier points that Brian had, just kind of about the lack of liquidity. And I think Ollie's going to get into that a little bit after me. But yeah, I think that the liquidity aspect is sort of two-pronged. We now, when I'm in the office, very rarely these days, but I'll sit with our real-time desk and talk about, what kind of liquidity do they see on the spot market in real time at different hubs. And exactly as Brian mentioned, with more entities joining EIM and now WEIS, that liquidity is really smaller in the spot market. So I think a lot of entities are more reticent to rely on spot market purchases to meet anticipated peaks, just simply because there's, the pie in the spot market is certainly smaller than even just a few years ago. I remember back, just a few years ago in real time where you could transact hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of megawatts in one specific sort of trading region. And what I'm being told now is that that's a little bit more challenging, certainly. And then, also we see a drop in liquidity in the forward markets as well. When I talk with my colleagues on the cash side and the short term and the term side, we see events in the markets happen and a flurry of trading activity occur. And it occurs to me that at least in the forwards, we see much less price elasticity, and we see prices gap rather quickly. And so I also appreciate what Brian talked about, is that's really challenging to managing your position from not only from a credit perspective, but just a price movement perspective as well. When prices escalate or fall rather quickly, and so it gets just very very difficult to manage. I think also one of the things that I'm certainly thinking about within the context of the issues of last summer specifically, and things that I think really haven't been resolved moving forward, are just ongoing what I'll characterize as seams issues. And so think of that as sort of one approach to a problem in one area, and then another approach to another problem in another region. And we'll just take one topic, the CPUC and CAISO's approach to RA, for instance. How does that approach really comport with the market rules and the market designs in other regions? We see specifically to the stakeholder processes ongoing at CAISO, the CAISO and CPUC needing to respond to just the fact that there is less dispatchable capacity available for import. And so if you design an import RA paradigm that works in one model but doesn't really comport with the rest of the system, what kind of gaps and seams issues does that create? I think a really poignant example of that is CAISO's proposed treatment for wheeling transactions. And there, certainly we have to recognize that, how do you sort of harmonize the approach of arranging wheeling service or accessing the transmission system in an OAT construct and in an ISO construct like in CAISO. And so that's, speaking for Shell Energy, we were very encouraged that specifically that the CAISO has committed to looking at that in a separate proposal, because I understand both perspectives that they have. Is, there are non-native load uses of the transmission system, and then you also have to allow open access of the transmission system to be used for wheeling service as well. And so how do you comport those two approaches? And these are really complex issues. And so I think that the more we all can come together and talk about it, I think the better. And then the big one, looking in back to summer 2020, is the pricing hub disconnects. You had the sort of hard cap construct in CAISO limited to $1,000 per megawatt, and external regions, sort of the mid-C and PV regions, you had a hard cap of $2,000. So all things equal, just because you have that administrative cap, that in pricing movements, that creates the incentive to, well, I'll just export from CAISO to serve PV at 1,500. Well, that approach, that price hub disconnect, just further deepens the issues and allows for exports in times when, you know, now we know that the CAISO was resource insufficient and they couldn't support those amount of exports. But when you put when you have a lower cap than other areas, it really creates the situation for another leg of the stool to ultimately be able to be kicked out and have the stool topple over. The good news is, looking forward, you know, I'm hoping that we can get to a place where at least the pricing hubs are all sort of equal and not gapped for this summer in 2021. I think that's something that's definitely very important. And so, yeah, a lot of encouragement there. And then I think the other thing kind of going forward that is sort of a seams issue is, you know, how does each region decide to handle RA needs? And so, you know, I personally have kind of a shout out to the Northwest Power Pool effort. I think it's very encouraging that the program was designed by and for and with the community that will be participating in it. You know, kudos to the region for coming together and recognizing the issues and really leaning into the problem and trying to move forward. And so, you know, that's kind of a very disjointed and rambling way of saying, you know, the ongoing seams issues and the lack of increasing issues with dispatchable capacity, I think will make pricing more difficult to manage. And so, you know, I think one of the things I'm thinking about moving forward is, how do we share dispatchable capacity, whether it's storage, thermal, whatever, to fill in and firm variable energy resources as they increasingly penetrate the West? Back in the days of sort of every BA for themselves, BAs had tools and firm capacity and duration unlimited generation sources that they could deploy. Now it's getting a lot harder because we have to manage those and balance those VERs as we face you know, a social mandate, a mandate to decarbonize. And so how do we benefit from these economies of scale? And I think that, you know, we can do that by reducing ongoing seams issues as it relates to RA, import, transmission access, and try to get our market design perspectives to really align with each other, you know, specifically price caps in the matter and that type of thing. And better yet, I think we have to work towards building a Northwest/Rockies RTO construct to ensure a better coordinated response and be able to, you know, dispatch resources on a wider basis to firm renewables where they're built. So those are just kind of some thoughts that I had. And so, yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. And at this point, I'll hand it over to, or I'll hand it back to you, Scott. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. I appreciate that perspective. And certainly, I do recall in the way back when the Northeastern RTOs were getting going, there was this concern that the bilateral market was drying up, but what was actually happening was that the bilaterals were just moving into the dispatch of the RTOs, and the bilateral contracts, instead of the one-for-one, became a contract for differences. And so therefore there was rich liquidity that just naturally moved from an OAT bilateral contract into the RTOs. And again, while we're very happy with some of the benefits that the EIMs brought us, we're not getting to that second step where you can just move your bilaterals into a contract for differences in an RTO. So hopefully we'll get to that sooner or later. I want to now move on to Ali. Ali is going to, I guess, you give us a little bit of perspective on sort of how the pricing's going, what things are shaping up, and sort of an update as events have taken us from a pricing and trading perspective. Why don't you unmute yourself, Ali? There you go.
Yeah, hi, Scott. Can you hear me? Good morning, everybody.
Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
Great. So, yeah, thanks for that. I'm coming to you from an empty trade floor, which I think is a metaphor for liquidity these days in the Western forward markets. You know, a general overview of prices for the summer, and Scott, you alluded to this. Definitely, the Desert Southwest is the highest price and premium market in the WEC, which is common for the summer months. I mean, if you go back years, typically in the months of June, July, August, you always see the Desert Southwest as the premium market. But I want to go back to prior to last summer's events. So, you know, going into summer of 2020, the forward markets for 2021 had the Southwest markets at a premium to California markets at a reasonable level. It was basically pricing at the cost of a wheel to export power. You know, the wheeling access charge, ancillary services. So Scott, you alluded to that around, you know, $15 to $20. Then, you know, the events of mid-August 2020 occurred. So the heat dome, as Tim referred to it, and prices exploded. So those spreads immediately after those events, when exports stopped clearing the CAISO day-ahead market, you know, almost tripled. And then they leveled off, and then they've continued to go up now since, as we're approaching the summer 2021 period. To give you an example, you know, the spread between the Pacific Northwest or Mid-Sea hub and the Southwest hubs right now for July and August is approaching triple digits. And that's for the 16-hour peak block, so hours 7 to 22. If you consider, you know, just the evening peak hours, say subset hours 18 to 21, it's likely in the multiple hundreds of dollars. So definitely the price signal is that the Southwest market is in need of that flow from the interconnect. And there's some concern as to whether they will get it based on the events of last summer. And that's why I think the current, you know, some CAISO Summer 2021 initiative and how they're coming up with scheduling priorities for exports, wheels, and loads is so critical. On normal days, I think, you know, everything's going to be fine and flow as planned, I think. But on those stress days, the CAISO guidelines is going to dictate what the flows are. You know, if you go back to that chart that Tim put up, I thought it was a great chart of the transmission use of the donut, as he referred to it. You had all the generation in the north and the load that was in need of that power in the south in the summertime. You know, there are some flows that go around the east side or the right side of the donut, but that's typically constrained. The majority of the flows go through California to get to the Southwest. And Ian alluded to this seams issue with respect to wheeling. And I think it really is a seam because you have the California market, which runs a bilateral capacity market and an energy-only dispatch model through the CAISO. Then you have the Southwest and other bilateral markets, which are a combined capacity and energy market where people are transacting the WSPP Schedule C product to get energy and capacity together with that product. So the friction arises when, you know, those energy exports that are trying to leave California, well, some of those are under a contract from a capacity perspective to loads in California. So, and likewise, some of the wheeling transactions that are trying to go from the Northwest to the Southwest, some of those are trying to use the exact same transmission lines that have the California LSCs have signed on for import RA contracts. So that's the friction that arises, and I don't envy the position that the CAISO's in, trying to balance their obligations, you know, to the loads in California, but also to be a transmission provider for open access flows.
So, Ali, it sounds as if what we're getting to is, and this goes to a liquidity question, that because loads outside of California want to get resources that aren't sourced in California, that you're sort of getting a WSPP contract that's which was supposed to be a standard contract. It's now sort of a bespoke WSPP contract. Does that sound about right?
That's right. So the standard WSPP Schedule C product that trades on ICE and in the broker markets, it's not source or region specific. So you trade that product and you find out the source on the day ahead. So after the events of last summer, where exports were limited on occasion, leaving California for the Southwest, what we saw trading now and is in high demand is a product in the Southwest that is non-CAISO gen, which is understandable. They want to remove that risk of curtailment or not flow. But ironically enough, it's not just Southwest load serving entities that are looking for that product. It's also California load serving entities, because they want non-CAISO gen for their import RA product as well. And that's understandable. They don't want to be importing energy that's sourcing from the CAISO, and that's actually a CPUC requirement now. So you've got the majority of load serving entities shopping for a product that's somewhat bespoke, which is a non-CAISO source, and that has also kind of bifurcated the market from a liquidity perspective for the forwards.
Wow, that certainly exacerbates an already tight situation, it would seem. Can any of you, I just saw that, Brian, you were looking at the screen during your presentation, maybe the other two were as well. Have you seen the spreads widen at all since the events in ERCOT?
I'm not sure exactly when the price movement happened. I mean, we made a summer purchase about a month and a half ago, and it's appreciated significantly in the last 4 weeks. And at the PV, July, August has gone up roughly, $20 a megawatt hour from when we had looked at purchasing. So I don't know if that came up in the last week. Wasn't really paying attention on our side for the ERCOT stuff, but
you're taken care of, right?
Yeah, you don't follow it as much when you feel like you're good to go. One thing on Ollie's point that he made mention too, as a load serving entity, we kind of make a daily assumption looking at buying a super peak product versus, a full heavy load WSPP Schedule C. And really what happens, and I know ICE has some liquid products that they've added in with the solar hours where you can actually sell or buy the solar hours and focus more on the super peak. And for our load specifically, I mean, we kind of have a sword point load. And so we really get exposed for 3 hours of the day. And you've got to make this judgment call every morning to say, do I buy super peak or do I buy heavy and sell the shoulders at a loss? And one thing I know that EDAM is looking to fix, and I don't know if this is going to actually happen, but where they give you a day ahead hourly pricing, just like CAISO does or another ISO, where you can put in demand bids or import bids on an hourly basis based on your load shape. Well, in the bilateral markets, that gets really tricky because super peak is not always as liquid as you like. And whenever you throw out, a bid for a super peak product, the prices come back, astronomical, because nobody wants to hedge that or can hedge that properly. So they do that through, offering a high price that it just kind of says, you know what, I'll just buy the heavy, sell the shoulders. So, with moving into these markets, definitely you get the price transparency a little bit better. But like I said, you still don't get the flexibility that you would in a standard market where you can hedge on transmission or you can hedge on your load. So, those are some other issues that happen, in the day ahead and real time markets for us.
Allie, do you have any perspective on the issue of any effect that ERCOT events have had on a possible widening of the spread between PV and SP? Yeah,
I don't know if it was the ERCOT events that in particular had an impact. I think these spreads with respect to historical spreads in the West are already at record highs, probably going back to the Western crisis. So it's already pricing in kind of tight conditions for the summer. I don't think they reacted necessarily in reaction to what happened in ERCOT. but,
Okay.
but it's more probably a function of the CAISO proposals being, more firmed up with respect to how they're going to treat exports vis-a-vis wheel-throughs, vis-a-vis loads.
So in other words, the rules get set. So now everybody knows what the expectations are. So then they can sort of set their book for that.
Exactly. I think that picture is coming into clearer focus around how California is going to handle this situation for this summer. And to Ian's point, I think there is a longer stakeholder process to come to look at how a long-term allocation of transmission can be done between loads and wheel-throughs, but there's just not enough time for this summer. So I think that's probably the biggest driver right now.
Yeah, no, there certainly is a time constraint, and especially when you're trying to factor in a stakeholder process, and then also you've got the CPUC process to wonder how that's going to affect them. We have a question from one of our audience members. What recommendations, and I think this sort of goes, Ali, to what you were just talking about, but beyond where CAISO has been, what recommendations would you make for CAISO as it develops scheduling guidelines for the summer? Is there anything else?
Yeah, I mean the one recommendation. So the CAISO is going to change their model from relying on bid and demand forecast. Tim looked at those charts where the days that actually ended up with load shed were based on actual demand being much higher than forecast. So the CAISO is actually moving towards a model where they're going to use the CAISO's own load forecast in the physical run or the RUC run. And I guess I would just hope that they're not overly conservative with that forecast, because exports and wheel-throughs are an important function of an interconnected market, and the Southwest is relying on that. And so an overly conservative CAISO load forecast will necessarily prevent exports and wheel-throughs from flowing. And so we hope that they balance that requirement. So that's kind of the only short-term recommendation. Longer term, I think there's probably some value in looking at how exports and wheel-throughs are handled in an OAT world. I don't think what the CAISO has come up with is too far off from that. Like in an OAT world, when a BA signs a long-term contract with a resource external to its service territory, they would go and reserve network transmission, and it would become a designated network resource, and that transmission would be kind of set aside, and only leftover transmission would be competed for by short-term wheel-throughs. And so I think the CAISO is trying to come up with a model that kind of looks at that and looks at what import RA contracts have been signed, so that there isn't a crowding out of import RA, for example, by wheel-throughs. So, but going forward, there's probably some better ways to look at that, so that unused import capability is given back to the market for wheel-throughs and economic imports and exports. Whereas right now, I think load is being given the advantage on imports over wheel-throughs, whereas maybe a model where if they don't sign those forward contracts for the import capability they've been allocated, then that transmission should go back into the market optimization function.
Oh, essentially a more efficient use of the transmission and providing incentives for people to plan ahead.
Yeah, and incentives for people to forward contract. So sort of a use it or lose it kind of construct.
Okay. One question that's come up, and it's the West. And I know we never talk about hydro in the West, but given the tightness of the situation, obviously whatever the hydro picture is determinative to some extent on how well we'll get through this. And it was odd, as I recall, that one of the reasons that things weren't as bad as they could have been in August was we had an unusual amount of hydro available to us in August, which is what you would normally not expect. And I think that came from British Columbia, but it's always weather dependent. Does anybody have any a sense of we're still in February, so it's not a complete picture, but what's the hydro situation in all the regions beginning to look like? Anybody want to share what the common discussion point is around that?
I can go, Scott, and then maybe Ian or Brian, feel free to jump in. But California hydro was low last year, and it's looking like another low year this year. The Pacific Northwest is, probably in the mid 90s, so it's looking healthier. But it remains to be seen if it can still have that late runoff like we had last year. So you're absolutely right. That last year, compared to historical average, we had probably 3 gigawatts more generation in late August than we would see in a normal kind of runoff. And this year, it remains to be seen if we'll be able to match that. But that is a concern if the Pacific Northwest doesn't have as the same hydro output late into the season as last year, especially combined with Boardman and Centralia 2 retirements that we saw in that region.
Brian, it's often forgotten that there is a hydro component to where you live, but it's a different beast entirely. How's the hydro picture looking for folks out your way?
Yeah, so a few things. The Colorado Basin is looking pretty bad this year. So far, we had a late dump here a few weeks ago with the storm system that came through, but the Colorado is actually looking pretty tough, and it's actually on a pretty downward decline long term, as you've seen in the news, Wall Street Journal articles or whatnot. One thing that's really interesting, and Ian talked about Navajo going away, is the Western Area Power Administration had some really interesting contracts where they would do exchanges from north to south based on the Walk system down south, and it's also the North Wacom area. Well, now that Navajo's gone away, they've actually found that there's a restraint headed south. So the hydro that's up north, other than Glen Canyon, there at Lake Powell, there's actually concern that there's not a lot of transmission capacity heading south out of the Wacom Balancing Area Authority because they're trying to keep it north because that exchange went away with the retirement of Navajo. So, with every retirement, the whole transmission system changes. Everybody has to reevaluate where they're getting their energy from. And so if you see where the hydro conditions get rough, all of a sudden it changes your whole picture again. And we'll see how that plays out this year based on Navajo being gone and it looking like a really interesting hydro condition. And I think people forget that in times of scarcity in the Southwest or in CAISO, the Rockies really have always been kind of this, a little bit of a savior. I worked on a real-time desk, and you would see prices in the high, 500 at CAISO or Pacific Northwest, and you could always call the Rockies, and there'd just be a huge spread. Because if you're willing to take the risk on wheeling and transmission, you can move that power over. One thing I think we saw this summer is that once prices get high in the Rockies region as well, you don't get those spreads, and so you don't move that energy as much. And so there's a lot of moving parts, and it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out in the next couple of years as retirements happen and hydro becomes the savior. But you have a bad hydro year, and all of a sudden it really changes everybody's attitude about how much they want to put into hydro on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I know that there's it's key caveat of what you just said. If you're willing to take the transmission risk for wheeling, then it used to be something that you could access, and what you're suggesting now is it's tight everywhere. So
yeah, and the EIM and WISE timelines is making it more constrained because now you're forecasting 2 or 3 hours out, and people are taking less risk because of that long lead time on scheduling.
I think this has been a useful perspective that you folks have provided. Ian, did you want to add something? I think you just taking yourself off mute.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to point out what and build a little bit on what Brian just said that I think is really a great observation. In that when you retire any units, your grid dynamics and the way power flows fundamentally changes. And while some of that can be modeled, you know, some of it is a little bit of a also just a wait and see until we get there kind of approach too, and that directly impacts transmission availability, transmission loading. And so, yeah, that's a great point, Brian, as it relates with the exchange in Navajo. You have the eastern part of WEC. You know, you could always get a spread, you know, moving between the Rockies and California or Southwest and the North and the Pacific Northwest, just because, frankly, the transmission out there is very weak and is highly pancaked. And so there's a lot of risk to moving across those regions. But yeah, that's a great point that, you know, does the transmission system from a reliability perspective or even wheeling perspective, does that change when you have local units retire? And I think one of the things that I think about that is, you know, that can affect reliability negatively or to the positive. You know, certainly one of those situations to the positive is, you know, perhaps we see the south of Alston congestion on the BPA network system get a little bit better when you following the retirement of Centralia. So I just want to tease out a little detail that, yeah, you can, there's a perspective to look out from retirement of generation, and there's also kind of a second order effect as it relates to that transmission or the retired generations interplay with the transmission system. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, no, that's always a good thing to keep in mind, and is one of those things that's not as transparent in an OAT world as it is in a network flow-based world, where the system is dispatched on that basis. We've got a couple of questions. So we talked about Centralia and Navajo being retired. Is there anything else affecting the transmission grid? Any other, I think you've covered all the other retirements, but are there any others that are sort of coming up in the meantime that may affect the transmission grid?
I think one of the ones I'm looking at is what's the future of Bridger. You know, certainly there's some uncertainty on that one, just given the fact it's a joint owned unit. Same thing goes for the remaining unit at Valmy. And of course, you know, there's always the ongoing drama saga of, you know, what's going on in Colstrip, Montana.
Interesting. For Ali, do you think the allocation of MIC to LSEs is analogous to setting aside network transmission to serve native load? And please define MIC.
Yeah, MIC is maximum import capability, and I believe it's allocated to load based on their load ratio share. So there's an allocation process where loads and kind of request which interties they would like an allocation. I think it is analogous to setting aside network transmission. I think the counter argument you'll hear from some market participants is that, but network transmission is open to competition for wheel throughs as well. So based on a first come, first serve, and also the duration of the request. So I think what some participants will argue is that they didn't have an opportunity to compete for that transmission that was allocated as MIC. But for the most part, if you look at a allocation that could be years long based on the load, you know, perhaps there aren't anybody that want to sign up for wheeling, you know, from Cobb all the way to Palo Verde on a, you know, annual basis or multi-year basis. Sure, there might be some that want to buy the months of July and August or certain hours of that. If you go back to like last year's paradigm, wheel throughs, because of the penalty pricing that we get on both the import and the export, they had the highest priority of all. So they could come along and, you know, just flow for a couple of hours a day, you know, the peak hours, and you know, grab that space. And I don't think that was really equitable either to California loads that had signed long-term or months-long contracts to flow on that transmission to be crowded out for just a few critical hours. So I think there's probably a longer term stakeholder process needed to kind of, fully vet these issues.
That's I think that's something that CAISO is contemplating, but again, there's what you need to get through right now and what you hope to accomplish in the next iteration. The time that we have left to us, we're looking to sort of go to the top of the hour. I wanted to see get a little bit of a discussion and some color around ERCOT. And unfortunately, some of my more loquacious friends in Texas may be listening to hearings that are going on in Texas right now. I'm happy to hear from anyone like Dave Francis, if you're willing to give us some color on this. But while we give Dave time to contemplate that, because everyone knows what a thoughtful person he is, tell me what the prices were looking like on the indexes that you guys were seeing last week, because obviously the gas prices were being affected in the West, and while they didn't spike the way they did elsewhere, certainly they were affected. What were the indexes looking like last week?
Scott, these are gas indexes in the West. So
let's divide that. Let's divide that into gas index, and let's say what was, I don't know, Palo Verde or Mead looking like? What were the highest electric ICE indexes?
Sure. So I think SP15 peaked out at around, so coming into the President's Day long weekend, prices were in the $30 to $40 range. Then SP for that weekend traded around 200, and then 450, and then back to 180, 110, and then back to 40. So definitely a spike up. You saw Palo Verde is the ICE product traded, the peak was around $375, and NP15 was below that, around 335. That still paled in comparison to what the gas indices were. Gas that was trading between $3 and $4 before that long weekend, quickly jumped up to low double digits, and then for that 4-day package over the weekend, you saw Citygate, be in the $150 range, and that's astronomical for gas. So, obviously the heat rates collapsed because the price of power paled in comparison to the cost of gas, and anybody that had to, buy gas at those prices, quickly probably went through some gas budgets that they had allocated for this year.
One person contributed who said that they saw a price of gas in Oklahoma last week at $1,250 an MMBTU. Wow, that's
Wow.
That's amazing. Wow, so this same commenter, who obviously doesn't want to be attributed to, says that this person still has concerns that CAISO's clearing price in the February 13th through 16th time frame did not represent marginal fuel. Because I guess we were not seeing, as you were suggesting, we were not seeing prices that were really that as peaky as some people thought we might have otherwise seen. Go ahead.
Sorry, Scott, I was just going to say, and I think that's right around that same time period when the CAISO sent out the notice that they were going to, change how they calculated fuel costs. So I think the question submitter is right that prior to that, I don't think the mechanism was there to flow through those costs until the CAISO changed that.
Okay, we've got one comment and question. It says, Ian talked about possible units coming offline in the near future. We've seen many issues with Diablo Canyon this past 6 months, and what fear percent do you put on the asset owners to decommission the unit earlier than the scheduled plan takedown of the unit, similar to what happened with Songs? That would certainly put us in effect. Anybody want to take a stab at the possibility of that happening?
I don't know if I'll put a probability on it, Scott, but I would certainly say that it's on people's radar as an additional factor that they're considering for this coming summer. And everyone's watching it closely for when it repowers up here in the spring.
Schedule for Diablo to come off? Anybody know? When? No, I mean to be retired.
2024 and 2025 for 1 and 2.
Okay. 24 and 25. Okay. Yeah. And what the concern is, because they're experiencing difficulties coming back from I think it was refueling, that you retire that unit a little bit earlier and then you're really in some difficulty. Okay. Wow. That's a scary thought. I'd like to sort of see what the oh wait, I got something that says in today's Texas Senate hearing, Garland Utility said they saw $1,100 a decatherm in the spot gas markets last week. So that was just in there in that Garland did. Well, this is occurring real time in the Texas hearings, and that's, I think, why we don't have some of our folks that would normally be here. People seem to be somewhat reluctant to discuss matters beyond what's currently available, I guess, because of the ERCOT, what's going on in ERCOT. Let me back up for just a moment and sort of pull away from this discussion. And since we're speaking about sort of the broader Western market, let me just put in a shout out to we've got the EIM board members. Anita is here, and John Prescott, Anita Decker and John Prescott. Why don't do you have any comments you'd like to sort of share with our group about what's on EIM on your radar screen in terms of EIM and CAISO working together to help prepare, or just any perspective that you want to offer?
This is John. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine, John.
Okay, thanks, Scott. And this has been a great meeting so far. My head's spinning with everything going on out there. And by the way, Rob is also, Kanzioka is on listening as well. We're not a quorum, but there's 3 of us on here. So, and I could say a couple of things, and certainly would invite Anita and Rob to make any comments. But right now, I think the governing body is kind of focused in 2 areas. One is we've got the governance review committee that a lot of you folks are helping with, to look at our governance structure and recommend any modifications to that. But front and center and coming up on our March agenda, which is being worked out, is going to be some decisional items dealing with the market readiness that the Cal ISO has been working on. And I think recently they come up with the final straw proposal, which actually increased our authority in several different areas, which I think is a good thing. So all of us in the governing body have been spending a lot of time digging through those different issues and getting ready to make that decision coming up in March. And I think this will be one of those situations where, we may not all see it the same way. There's a lot of different opinions on this, and our job in the governing body is to make sure we hear all those different opinions and get us ready for the decisions. So I'll stop there and then see if Anita and or Rob want to make any other comments.
Thanks, John. Anita or Rob, either one of you? Okay. Well, thank you. Now, Anita, did you just come off mute?
I did. So Scott, just thank you. This really has been a great meeting. I really enjoyed the panel and the perspective of those that are trying to use the system. And that was really, really helpful. And yesterday also with the FERC commissioner as well. But we can't get into decision-making things, obviously, but I think John really nailed what is on our minds. And what I want to assure your membership is that many of us on the governing body have been on calls, have been talking with stakeholders, and we're really doing a lot of outreach, trying to understand what is the perspective to make sure that we have good information to get to good decisions. So I would also invite anybody that wants to contact any of the governing body members to please do so. This is very timely. We do make ourselves available, and we do want to hear other people's perspectives. So I'll conclude with that. But Scott, thank you for the opportunity.
We're always happy to hear from you folks, and we appreciate your participation. We have a hearty few that are here, and I just look to any of them to see if they have any comments that they want to offer. They can take themselves off mute if they want to. Even the loquacious Gary Ackerman he says he has nothing to add. Retirement has taken it out of him. Let me just bring this what I think is this successful meeting to a conclusion. I'm sorry that you folks couldn't be here with us for this wonderful venue. We hope you'll join us in July for our summer one. Get out and get your vaccines, okay? Do whatever you need to do to get your vaccines so we can all get together, a cocktail hour, and share some conversation and network as we're supposed to do. We're looking to be having a roundtable later on as we get closer to the summer months to discuss preparations for the summer. I'll be reaching out to several people to participate in that roundtable. And hopefully that'll be the last of our sort of big Zoom events that we'll be getting back to in-person events after that. Again, look at the WPTF website. It's up on the regional on our meetings tab. You can see what it is that you can be experiencing in July. Let me thank Commissioner Clements from FERC for speaking with us, being our keynote speaker. I thought she was excellent. Appreciate Neha Palmer from Google giving her perspectives on the need for an RTO in the West, given the energy needs that they have. I appreciate the hearty few who came out here, especially our guests from Arizona. Arizona is trying to make great strides in terms of wholesale competition as well as retail competition, and anything we can do in that regard, we're happy to do. And so I look forward to seeing all of you at Coeur d'Alene, Idaho in July, and would welcome your feedback on how this went. Frank, is there anything I need to cover? We're good? All right, well, this is Scott Miller saying good night and good luck.